his day, one of the leading scholars on Rome, and actually a lot of the things in sort of classics studies as far as context is concerned is from Peter Brown. But I think the thing I love about Brown is he really gets what Augustine's trying to say. So, most Augustine scholars today are either French and like don't believe a word that Augustine said, or are really, strangely enough, like pretty heavily left-leaning Catholics, like so more on the liberal side of the Catholic faith. So a lot of like top-tier Augustine studies are by people who like disagree with everything Augustine has to say, which I find like really sad. So anyway, some great biographies. Grab those, look at them if you want. They're really helpful. So, okay, first and foremost, if you've got your outline, I want to look at two things to start off, and then we'll dive right into some biography, just so we kind of understand what's going on with Augustine. But first question I want to ask is why study Augustine to begin with, right? I remember one time I was doing a church history thing at a church, and somebody was like, we just need the Bible. You don't need church history. You need the Bible, which is like, yes, true. But especially with our mature saints here, sometimes having somebody kind of come along and help you apply the Bible in a time and a circumstance that's a little bit different than your own, yet like strangely similar, really helps you cut through the weeds. So one thing, though, in studying Augustine, why I think this is a benefit, in order to just understand most anything, society, church, culture, theology, you really have to understand Augustine, right? To understand where we are today at some capacity. I think I've got some more over there if you. To understand really anything today, you actually have to engage with Augustine at some points. And if you just do like any sort of general Western philosophy course at any notable or even unnotable institution, at some point you're going to intersect with Augustine. His thinking is that profound. But one of the glorious benefits of Augustine in that while, yes, his thinking is so incredibly profound and impactful for us as a society, he is a truly born-again, sold-out for Jesus person. Here he is faithfully following the Lord and doing so at a profoundly deep level. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, is Augustine's world is a world of massive change and unrest and transition, as we'll hopefully see today. And people in Augustine's day struggled to get their bearings in the moment because there's just so much, like the whole world as they knew it is in a time of transition, or what some sociologists today call a gray zone. And in a similar way, I think, in the midst of this great time of unrest and transition, as the rest of the world in Augustine's time struggled to get their bearings, and we likewise are, on the cusp of, one of, or maybe numerous, of the strangest revolutions, the world, just technology being what it is, going from my relative youth to now. I didn't have a computer or internet in my home until I went to seminary. So, which was like less than 10 years ago. And so here we are where like everybody has a computer in their pocket. And so we're likewise at a very similar time where the whole world is very different. And we're trying to catch up. And so often as we kind of, if you study church history, especially church history in the 20th century, it seems like regularly the church is struggling to really to address the issues of the day. It seems like regularly, Francis Schaeffer brings this out quite a bit, the fact that that regularly theology in the church are the last thing to be informed of the standing of the society of the day. And so we're oftentimes behind the ball. But what was so unique about Augustine, when the rest of the world and even the church is off doing one thing, Augustine steps in and engages the culture on the front end. And so, when the rest of the Roman world was completely behind on the 8 ball and trying to kind of set the pace and understand what was going on, Augustine steps up and he's like, this is what's happening. And he crushed it, like absolutely nailed it. And we look back now and hear Augustine's words, especially from his theological perspective, which is likewise our theological perspective, and we go, he nailed it. How did he do it? And so one of the big questions, I think, today that's even germane about why we're studying Augustine is one of the questions that people have asked recently. Is the church today more like the 2nd century or the 4th and 5th century? And I've heard compelling cases for both, and maybe in some degrees, depending on your context, will drive that. But I think, just given the culture of our day being in this massive transition, I would argue, perhaps, that the 4th and 5th century is probably closer. And Augustine can tell us a lot, because that's where Augustine was in that very thing. So, here's where we're going. My thesis for the next 8 or so weeks is that every Christian, no matter what your education is or how long you've walked with the Lord, every Christian can and should read, understand, and learn something from our older brother Augustine in the faith. And I think if you have the right tools, every Christian can actually pick up something from Augustine that will benefit them as they seek to faithfully follow Jesus. So, with that, let's look at some biography. First and foremost, let's get some context of what's going on in Augustine's day. First, Augustine is born in 354 in a little town called Thagasta, which is in modern-day Algeria. It's a sort of northern African city. It's still there today. It's nothing like I had envisioned it looking. I was, thinking it was like far more deserts, but it's actually pretty mountainous, which we'll see kind of contributes to somewhat of the thing going on. But in the Roman culture, you really need to back up to Constantine to really understand Augustine. There's in the, if you just study Roman history, Rome enters into its glory days, many would argue, in the 2nd century A.D., and then Constantine comes along, and there's this massive shift, and some people blame, the crumbling of the empire on him and what follows. I won't argue that, but Constantine comes along. He's the first Christian emperor, and there will only be one more non-Christian from that point on. So this really establishes the norm of Christianity to have a prominent place in the empire with Augustine. And so when we get to Augustine's time, Christianity is at least a prominent place, a largely culturally accepted religion. And the worldview that follows, as well as it could be applied, is generally thought of as like, this is fine. It was good to be a Christian. You could be a Christian freely and openly. And so there was a prominent place in the empire because of Constantine and his work. And so when you get to Augustine's Rome, it's what many could at least call to some degree a Christian Rome. There was a thriving Christianity at this point, at least in some regard. There are priests and bishops in place. The Christian architecture of the 4th and 5th century is magnificent. If you ever get a chance to go to the Mediterranean and see, just Rome itself, and see some of the mosaics and the architecture of this time, it is beautiful. Even if you just get to Google it. I've never been to Rome, but I read books. Anyway, but with that, there's this thriving Christianity that as it's growing, it's really like it's hit a growth spurt. It's gone through this lengthy persecution era where strangely enough, the persecution of the early church has sent down these deep roots theologically, and so we have these glorious works on the work of the Trinity as Christians are being killed. And now we're at the time where it's thriving, and so you're really watching it grow up, going from house church movements to cathedrals. And in some regards, like the general ethos of Christianity follows suit. Yet, also, as we'll see whenever we look at Augustine's controversy with Pelagius, there's still a fair amount of malpractice within Rome in particular. So it's not like this golden city where everybody gets along and it's not quite what certainly not what anyone would call a city on the hill, 4th or 5th century Rome. While the church is doing well and thriving in some capacity, it's also a place that's filled with sinners. So anyway, bearing that in mind, Christian Rome is really more because Christianity is an accepted thing. But it's still a fairly pagan place, right? The games are still happening. And they'll remain in place for a fairly long time. And there's still, as we'll see, especially towards the end of Augustine's life, a sudden flare-up in the old Greco-Roman tradition. This underlying movement or a constant tension to say, the reason why the empire is falling apart is because of this Christianity stuff, because it's soft, right? If you want to have an empire that lasts another 1,000 years and covers largely the entire known world, you can't have any of that soft stuff about loving your neighbor as yourself or turning the other cheek. That just won't stand. The Roman way is strong, glory and valor. That's what holds the kingdom together. And so you have this tension of one kind of ideology overlapping with another, and so these two things are somewhat pulling apart. And as Rome is kind of crumbling before their very eyes, which it's a slow decline until it's not a slow decline, it's a fast decline. These two tensions are pulling at one another in a really tight sort of way as these two things engage. And so Rome is falling apart. Political coups are constant. Life is brutal. Plague is regular. The barbarians are barbarians. Social strata is in upheaval. And so this concept of what it means to be Roman is in flux, which is why Augustine is priceless, because Augustine comes in and says, Roman or not, there's a kingdom that far transcends this world. As the author of Hebrews says, that Rome, as much good as it's done, it is an empire and a kingdom that will be shaken. But there's a different kingdom that remains, that is unshakable and not of this world. So that's the Roman context that Augustine grows up in. And there's been recent scholarship to say, to kind of denigrate how Roman Augustine was. I think Augustine is Roman enough. But there's this other aspect of Augustine. Augustine is African. And Africans in this time, particularly in North Africa, are a very proud people. There are two primary groups in Augustine's Africa and his upbringing. The Punics, as they're called, the Punic Wars, they're actually immigrants, Western Phoenicia, so they're Semitic. We hear about them in the Old Testament, at least to some degree. And they're relatives of the Canaanites and the Philistines. Augustine will even call them Canaanites. And they're the seafaring people, and they are utterly brutal. The Punics were a brutal, and you can, Hannibal of Carthage, he's a Punic, and he is a cutthroat guy. And so that's one group, the Punics on one side. The Berbers are on the other. Most scholars think that Augustine is actually from Berber descent. The Berbers are actually still there. They're a nomadic people that live in literally the harshest climates known to mankind, and their culture follows. They are a hard people. And so anyway, in North Africa, what you have are primarily two culturally tough warring peoples, the Punics and the Berbers, I should say. And just by nature, by climate, by disposition, by culture, they are tough people. But what's interesting it is in North Africa during the time of Augustine, through, I think, the preaching of the gospel and a genuine move of the Spirit, Christianity takes a full-orbed effect in North Africa. Many scholars actually look to the North African context in which Augustine grows up in and says, yeah, that's the Bible Belt of the Roman world. And so what you actually have are these like super tough people. Like they know no fear at all, and they are absolutely sold out for Jesus, which is like a really interesting thing to watch, right? To watch a group of like oil riggers just become sold out for Jesus, and they probably like the most soft they could possibly be. The way they tell you that they love you is a good handshake and eye contact sort of thing. That might be where this is, but it's actually probably more than that. We could actually probably argue that the Christianity that Augustine grows up in with these two people groups are really more like if ISIS got converted or Boko Haram got converted. These people who know one thing, and that's fight and win, or die, but die with honor, and fight at all cost, suddenly get converted, and it's all about Jesus. And so if you disagree with them on a crucial point of doctrine, they're coming at you pretty hard. And so this is really the culture where they're both tough warring peoples, yet they're also deeply committed to the Bible and to Christ and to orthodoxy in particular, where this robust Christian faith is. And they would also be quick. They're a very proud group. So they're quick to tell you that, yes, maybe we are citizens of the Roman Empire, but we are African. And especially later on in Augustine's life, he'll actually lead with that. He of course, speaks beautiful Latin. Many in this context did not speak Latin, but spoke a native tongue. But they all lead with, before I'm Roman, I am African. And so Christianity really takes hold here in a particular way. The two guys that they love, and we'll see time and time again influencing them, follow much of their culture the way that they do. The way they do theology is Tertullian of Carthage and Cyprian of Carthage. And both tended to be, how shall we say, polemical for most of their ministry, even at times when they didn't necessarily need to be. And so anyway, all that to say, Augustine is growing up in somewhat of a Bible Belt fundamentalism, perhaps, and even militarism will kind of crop up throughout time. But they're on fire for Jesus, and their first reaction is to fight. So there are good things that maybe come from that, and there are a lot of bad things that come from that, as we shall see. So, Augustine's parents, Patrick and Monica are their name, both thought to be Berber by descent. Patrick was a middle-class landowner from all intents and purposes. Like, this is the beauty of Augustine. If you have this sort of story, then you're in good company. Augustine's dad, workaholic, not a very emotional man, not emotionally available. He's not affectionate in any way, shape, or form. But he's going to work really hard to make sure that his son has every opportunity for upward mobility. Anybody have a dad? You don't have to raise your hand. But that's Augustine's dad. That sounds familiar. Patrick, for most of his life, so far as we can tell, is not a Christian. or even like religiously minded, which is another thing that probably shocks people. We just assume the ancient world, everybody's religious by nature. Patrick appears to not be. He's really more concerned with work and getting the job done and making sure that his son has every opportunity. Food on the table, a roof over your head. You don't need I love you. I provided for you. The end, moving on. On the other side of things, Monica is Augustine's mom. She is like the central figure in Augustine's life, just without a shadow of doubt. Nobody is more important to Augustine's formation than his mom. Monica is a devout Christian. From what we can tell, she's likely raised in a Christian home, so she's not a first-generation Christian. She's well acquainted with the Christian tradition. She is very devoted to Jesus, and she is an absolute helicopter mom. Like, the picture of helicopter mom. And so, once again, and this is a picture we've probably seen. Dad, emotionally unavailable, works all the time, is almost never there, probably struggles to have any sort of conversation outside of what kind of grades did you get today? A B is not good enough, son. Try harder, or you're grounded. And then mom is like, what'd you do today? Who'd you talk to? Where did you go? Or do you have good friends? Do you have bad friends? What kind of conversations do you have? What are you into? It seemed like last week you were more into this, but now you're into this. So what happened? Tell me about that. Are you sleeping well at night? Are you eating all of your lunch? Don't eat any snacks that you're not supposed to. So she's just there all the time. It's actually really reassuring that here we have this family unit. He also has siblings, but it looks really familiar. And both are sacrificing so that Augustine could have the best education that could be afforded. That's something that almost seems a little bit, well, maybe it kind of goes with her helicopter momness, but even Monica is like, you need upward mobility, and will give Augustine a lot of pushback. So, with that, born 354 in Thagasta, modern day Algeria, schooling and education. This is actually a really important part of Augustine's formation. He's schooled in the classics, very kind of standard style, and he starts out as just a decent student, but he's nothing phenomenal, which is also interesting, right? Because as we study and read Augustine, he's so innovative and so creative, yet also like the depth of his thinking it is staggering once you really get into his primary sources. But he starts out as like a B student, which means he was always in trouble with his dad. Obviously, the struggle there. And in classics, what does he have to learn? He's got to learn Latin, which he does pretty well, but probably didn't speak it at home, interestingly enough. But he also has to learn Greek, and he really, really struggles with Greek. In fact, he writes in his Confessions about having to learn some of the Greek writers and just getting frustrated and being like, I hated it. It was the math of his day, right? It was calculus. I hated it. The Greek is, all these stupid participles and infinitives and definite articles everywhere. It's a nightmare. Just give me Latin with its 80 bazillion declensions. That's way easier. But anyway, B student, nothing great until this is the great moment, like a massive moment that not even just in the Confessions, but like weirdly enough, in a lot of Augustine's doctrinal treatises that like this almost has no business coming to. He comes back to Cicero constantly. Something happens with Cicero as he reads what's now a lost work, his Hortensius. We don't have it anymore. Every kind of quote that we actually have from that work of Cicero is almost exclusively from Augustine. But he reads that book and studies it, and something happens. His mind is absolutely set ablaze. And from that moment on, it took, strangely enough, the Lord in his divine providence brings Augustine to a work, for all intents and purposes, by a pagan philosopher And that sets Augustine's course on a lifelong pursuit of wisdom. He will never be the same again. He has to have life's big answers answered. And from, this is probably somewhere around 14 or 15 till the time he dies in his 70s. Constantly running through Augustine's mind is his encounter with Cicero. That Cicero, as Lewis will say about George MacDonald, in some capacity baptizes his imagination. And so from this moment on, Augustine is a voracious studier. He has a massive library at the end of his life, even for modern comparison in an ancient world where books are difficult to come by. He still has an absolutely massive library, and he's read all of it and retains all of it, which is incredible. But as he's, education is a huge component, but this other aspect of his life is also equally formative, and that's his sense of guilt. Early on in life, this is Augustine recounting for us in his Confessions, which we'll dig more into at a later date. But he notices early on in life an insatiable desire for joy and love, or just something more, right? It's almost intranslatable, the emotion of what Augustine will eventually call restlessness. His longing from his earliest age of looking around and thinking, ugh, like this deep frustration that I'm experiencing. There's an itch that I can't scratch, or there's a depth that I can't fill, and there's just something missing, but I don't know what it is. And he'll experience and go for everything. And so Cicero kind of playing into a pursuit of wisdom is one thing. Like that setting, maybe if I pursue wisdom enough, I'll finally scratch my itch. But there's something more. And it's interesting that how this kind of plays out in his adolescence. Probably one of the more famous stories really in all of ancient work, but is Augustine with the pears, right? If you've read the Confessions, you'll know the story. If you haven't, you may still know the story. But Augustine, was with his less than, Monica wouldn't approve of them, let's say that. He's with a group of friends that helicopter mom Monica would not approve of. And one day, they're out kind of roaming around, and they stumble upon this pear orchard. Now, another thing to kind of bear in mind of the context in North Africa is it's agriculturally a very rich place. There was Peter Brown does this in a different book where he kind of compares and contrasts what most people think of North Africa as like this weird backwater. They're exceedingly wealthy because the land is just so rich. And in Rome today, there's actually an artificial mountain or hill. It's like 150 feet tall. And it was just kind of there until recently they did an archaeological dig, and they found out it was all the clay jars that people had like shattered. It was a dump site. And it was because of they lived off of bread and olive oil, and they would just finish the thing of olive oil and they would throw it in this trash heap, and now it's like this artificial mountain. But where did all the olives come from? Most of them actually came from North Africa, or fruits and vegetables. Most of it actually came from North Africa, and so you have what people consider to be this kind of backwater sort of place, which is actually a place of a fair amount of wealth. So they stumble upon this pear grove, which are everywhere there, at least during this time, or this pear orchard, and they're walking through, and they decide, you know what we're going to do? We're going to steal the pears. And he talks about, we stole all of these pears, and part of it was really just more for the exhilaration, and here we have our pears. And then he says, and we just threw them to the pigs. We didn't steal because we were, physically hungry. We stole because we thought that maybe stealing would give us at least some sort of sense of life. That if we did something on the edge or something out of the ordinary, we maybe could scratch that itch. And it did for just a second. that sudden feeling of exhilaration. Now we're experiencing life. But then he leaves and he goes, and at the end I was even more empty. Right? The stealing of the pears did absolutely nothing, really. And what did we come to find out? We were just more restless than before. It'll be at roughly this point, though, as kind of his guilt carries over, Augustine and sex become like a kind of an intertwined thing. It's a central component for the rest of his life, and he'll return to it regularly as he kind of thinks and unpacks much of his life, both in the Confessions and elsewhere in his writings. So, young adulthood. At a young age, he is educated. He is a voracious reader. He really starts to pick up notoriety. This is a real deal scholar, particularly in rhetoric, which is, that was what you wanted him to go be, right? Helicopter mom, workaholic dad who's trying to get to upward mobility. You don't become a doctor or a lawyer. I guess a rhetorician is kind of like that. You want him to become a rhetorician, because a rhetorician is where all the money and accolades are. Is it time already? Oh. So biography is going to be in 2 parts. And we are looking at the first part today, and we'll look at, honestly, the really, really good stuff is next week. So we should probably just finish there. So I'll pray, and then we'll pick up with adult Augustine. That's what we'll do. We had childhood Augustine. Now we'll look at Augustine's adulthood after that. So let's pray, and we'll finish there. Please come back for more. Gracious Lord, how we thank you, O Lord, for the faithfulness of your servant Augustine, who we can say in the words of Apostle Paul, as he prays, he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so, Lord, may we imitate Augustine, who is imitating Paul, who is imitating Christ. Lord, may this succession of faithfulness to you, a life of living in light of your divine glory, a life of repentance, be marks that we have of our lives as they were marks that Augustine had in his. And now, O Lord, send us, your servants, into the world, that we, like our older brother Augustine, might proclaim the good news in the world around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you all so much. I'm excited for this series.